And thank you to all of you for taking the time to join us today. I'm very happy and excited to share some of my recent research findings with you. I'm hoping that my results will bring out some questions. I'm very much looking forward to your questions and suggestions. All right, so let me start with the key themes of my presentation in the next slide. During the pandemic, temporary shutdown orders and social distancing measures led to many businesses to close and caused a sharp decline in employment, resulting in a dramatic decline in the number of individuals participating in the labor force. Prime age individuals who are between ages 25 and 54 have been driving these changes in the aggregate labor force statistics. In this presentation, I'll try to answer three key questions. How does pandemic-related job losses affect employment and labor force participation of prime age individuals? Which groups within the prime age group have been hit the hardest by these job losses? And which groups are the farthest from a full recovery in their labor market outcomes? Now, before moving to answering these questions, let me first tell you a little bit about the data that I'm going to be using in this presentation. So that's going to be on the next slide. All the statistics that I will show you today are based on micro level or individual level data from the current population survey, or the CPS. The CPS is the primary source of labor force statistics and demographic data for the US population. Every month, the BLS uses the survey information to publish the unemployment rate. The Census Bureau collects survey data at a monthly frequency from approximately 60,000 households, which is representative of the US population. And the survey has a really high response rate, which is one of the highest among the government surveys. Next, I want to remind you some labor force related terms that I'm going to be using throughout my presentation in the next slide. Economists group individuals ages 16 and over into three labor force categories based on their responses to the CPS survey. If a person has a job and is working, that person is employed. If a person does not have a job, but is actively searching for a job and is available to work, then that person is unemployed. If a person does not have a job and is not actively searching for a job, then that person is not in the labor force. Then the total population for the age group 16 and over corresponds to the sum of employed, unemployed, and those not in the labor force. Labor force corresponds to those who are employed and unemployed. Then it brings me to the word that I'm going to be using the words most today, the labor force participation rate, which is basically the share of individuals who are in the labor force in the total population. And then lastly, as I mentioned, I'm going to be focusing on prime age individuals who are between ages 25 and 54. And why is that so? Well, first, they correspond to the largest group among the employed individuals. Second, they're at their most productive working years, which means they're a very important group when we think about productivity in the economy and economic growth. And they're more likely to have young children compared to younger and older individuals, which is important when we consider the impact of the pandemic on working parents. All right, now let's move to more exciting things in the next slide. Measures taken to fight the pandemic, such as temporary shutdown orders and social distancing measures, have caused substantial job losses in the United States. More specifically, the total employment declined by almost 25 million from February to April 2020. And importantly, the majority of these losses were experienced by prime age individuals. Their employment declined by over 13 million, from a little over 100 million to 87 million from February to April, as we can see in this chart. This is a very sizable decline. So just to put it into context, we can compare it to the job losses during the 2008 global financial crisis or the Great Recession, shown by the gray shaded region in the left. During the Great Recession, prime age employment declined by around 5.4 million over the course of 2 years. Much dramatically, during the onset of the pandemic, job losses were almost 3 times this amount and happened in just 2 months. Since April of last year, we have seen recovery in the labor markets, which meant job gains for prime age individuals. However, as of May of this year, prime age employment still remains almost 4 million below the pre-pandemic levels. Now, given the unique nature of the pandemic, job losses did not only result in a large increase in the unemployment rate, but also a large decline in the labor force participation rate, which we turn to in the next slide. Here, the green line shows the labor force participation rate of prime age individuals. And it shows that it declined by over 3 percentage points from around 83% to less than 80% from February to April 2020, meaning some displaced workers left the labor force as opposed to searching for new jobs. Here I'm also plotting the aggregate labor force participation rate for all individuals ages 16 and over with the blue line, just to show you that it followed quite closely the patterns in the participation rate of prime age individuals. A decrease in the labor force participation rate is expected during the downturn. However, again, the decline this time was much sizable. If we remind ourselves what happened during the Great Recession, again, we look at the gray area in the left, and we see that the participation rate decline was very modest. This means job losses mainly caused a large increase in the unemployment rate with less impact on participation. However, that's not the case this time. Another disappointing thing is if you look closely, you can see that prime age labor force participation rate has been on an increasing trend since 2015. And unfortunately, the pandemic has erased that progress. Now let's move on to focus on the onset of the pandemic. Here I'm showing you the prime age labor force participation rate alongside the employment to population ratio, both indexed to the year February 2020 levels. So the lines represent where these statistics stand in comparison to their pre-pandemic levels. Both rates declined steeply from February to April, as you can see by the dashed line where the April numbers stand. Then we see starting in May, labor market conditions recover, but the improvements have been very uneven. The prime age employment rate rose significantly through the second half of last year, but the prime age labor force participation rate recovered only slightly. Moreover, the momentum appears to have stalled more recently. During this year, both rates showed only slight improvements. Focusing on the prime age labor force participation rate, it remains 1.8 percentage points below its pre-pandemic level. This means 2.2 million prime age workers are yet to return to the labor force. Now, as I mentioned before, prime age individuals are in their most productive working years, and a persistent decline in their labor force participation rate has important implications for the future of the labor market and economic growth. However, to understand the decline, we need a more detailed analysis. We need to consider differences in the labor market outcomes by different demographic groups within prime age individuals. So that's what we're going to do now. Changes in aggregate labor force participation rates mask large differences across different sex and education groups within prime age individuals. Women have historically had lower participation rates than men, and individuals with lower educational attainment have had lower participation rates than their college-educated counterparts. To account for these differences, I compared changes in the labor market outcomes across sexes and education levels. So to facilitate comparison, I grouped prime age individuals into 4 groups. Men with less than a bachelor's degree, which I also call non-college men, men with a bachelor's degree or higher, which I call college men, and similar ones for women, non-college women, and college women. Now in this chart, starting with men, we're looking at changes in the participation rate of prime age men of different education groups. Again, this is in comparison to their levels pre-pandemic. While the participation rates declined for both groups at the onset of the pandemic, less educated prime-age men, shown by the blue line, experienced a slightly larger decline compared to college-educated men during the beginning of the pandemic. Since May of last year, participation has been improving for both groups. The green line shows that the recovery has been steady for college-educated men, and their participation rate is almost back to the pre-pandemic level. But that is not the case for men without a bachelor's degree. The recovery has been less. Turning to women in the next slide, we actually see a very different pattern at the onset of the pandemic. While the participation rate declined for both groups, less educated prime-age women, shown by the blue line, experienced a much larger decline in their participation compared to college-educated women. And then when we consider the recovery, the labor force participation rate for college-educated women is close to a full recovery, but that is definitely not the case for women without a bachelor's degree. In the next slide, we're going to put all these four groups together and look at the labor force participation levels. Now, there are several takeaways from this table. First, as the first row shows, the prime-age labor force participation rate was at 83.1% in February 2020. As of May of this year, the aggregate prime-age labor force participation rate is 1.8 percentage points below its pre-pandemic level, despite the recovery in the labor market conditions since last year. Second, the participation rate was the greatest for college-educated men at almost 95%, followed by college-educated women at almost 85% before the pandemic. And the participation rates were much smaller for those without a bachelor's degree. Third, participation rates are farther from recovery for both college-educated and non-college prime-age women compared to their male counterparts. So this means the gap between the labor force participation rates of men and women has widened for both education groups. Lastly, and most importantly, non-college women who had the lowest participation rate prior to the pandemic are farthest from a full recovery, with their participation rates 3.4 percentage points below the pre-pandemic level. The large declines in participation of non-college individuals in general and non-college women in particular may be explained by the severity of job losses during the onset of the pandemic, which I turn to in the next slide. This table shows that prime-age employment declined by over 13 million between February and April of 2020 and remains 3.7 million below its pre-pandemic level as of May 2021. Women, especially those without a bachelor's degree, have been disproportionately affected by these job losses, as I documented in a research article last year. In the non-college group, 5.6 million women and 4.9 million men lost jobs between February and April of last year. In contrast, this was much less in the college-educated group, where 1.5 million women and 1.3 million women lost jobs. But which industries did we see these job losses? This is on the next slide. Majority of the job losses during the pandemic were in contact-sensitive sectors, such as education and health services, leisure and hospitality, and retail trades. I call these sectors the hardest hit industries. This chart shows the declines in employment for all four groups in the left panel and broken down by the hardest hit industries in the right panel. The right panel shows that the majority of job losses in the contact-sensitive sectors were experienced by non-college men and women. Jobs in these sectors are much less likely to be teleworkable. Therefore, many displaced workers in these sectors likely did not search for new jobs due to business closures across the country and fear of contacting the virus while working. And this resulted in a larger decline in the labor force participation rates of non-college men and women. In contrast, the smaller decline in employment for the college group likely reflects that more college-educated individuals worked in teleworkable jobs, which accounted for only a small share of job losses among prime-age individuals. Again, this is another topic that I wrote a short article on last year. So Erin will be sharing those links with you. Now let's move on to the next slide, where we look at the net change in employment as of May of this year. Despite the labor market recovery since April of last year, employment remains around 1.5 million below the pre-pandemic level for non-college men and over 2 million below the pre-pandemic level for non-college women, as we can see on the left panel. Jobs in contact-sensitive sectors have recovered more slowly, potentially explaining the slower recovery of employment for prime-age men and women without a bachelor's degree. Moreover, many of the jobs that are yet to recover for non-college individuals are in these contact-sensitive sectors that are shown in the right panel. So far, I showed that women without a bachelor's degree experienced the greatest deterioration in their labor market outcomes, both employment and labor force participation, during the pandemic-induced downturn. Moreover, these women are the farthest from a full recovery. Now let's focus on these women only and do an even more detailed analysis by race and ethnicity in the next slide. Labor force participation rates have historically differed across race and ethnicity groups, and the recent decline in non-college women's labor force participation may too have been uneven across these groups. To account for these differences, I compared changes in the labor market outcomes of non-college women in 3 race and ethnicity groups: non-Hispanic white women, non-Hispanic Black women, and Hispanic women. This chart shows the labor force participation rates over time for all 3 groups. Again, this is in comparison to the pre-pandemic levels. Here are 2 important results. First, the labor force participation rate declined the most for Hispanic women, shown by the green line, and non-Hispanic Black women, shown by the orange line, while the least decline was for non-Hispanic white women, shown by the blue line, at the onset of the pandemic. Second, while labor force participation rates have been recovering for all groups, the participation rates for Hispanic women and non-Hispanic Black women remained farthest from a full recovery until March of this year. Interestingly, though, we have seen an increase in the participation rate of non-Hispanic Black women and a slight decline in the labor force participation rate of non-Hispanic white women in April and May of this year. Moving on to the next slide. Now I'm showing you the labor force participation rates for these 3 groups, before the pandemic and after the pandemic. Looking at the participation levels by race and ethnicity, we see that non-Hispanic Black women had the highest labor force participation rate, and Hispanic women had the lowest labor force participation rate pre-pandemic, as we can see in the first column. This ordering has not changed after the pandemic. Hispanic women continue to have the lowest labor force participation rate among all prime-age women without a bachelor's degree. Moreover, as of May 2021, their participation rate is almost 5 percentage points below the pre-pandemic level, which is the farthest from a full recovery compared to other groups. The declines in the participation rates of non-college women have been driven by large job losses in the hardest hit industries during the pandemic. Moreover, they have disproportionately impacted Hispanic women, as is also evidenced by the decline in their labor force participation rate. And lastly, I want to consider the impact of presence of young children for women's labor market outcomes in the next slide. Remote schooling and daycare closures during the pandemic created challenges to work for many parents, but especially those of young children. A lack of access to childcare, the demands of home and virtual schooling, and health concerns may have kept women with young children, which I define as children under age 13, out of the labor force. To account for this possibility, I will now compare changes in the participation rates of non-college women with and without children to their college-educated counterparts. First, non-college women, both with children, shown by the orange line, and without children, shown by the yellow line, experienced larger declines and slower recoveries in their labor force participation rates compared to college-educated women. Second, comparing the blue and green lines shows that the declines in the participation rates look very similar for college-educated women with and without young children during the downturn and the recovery. In fact, the labor force participation rates of both groups of college-educated women seem to have almost fully recovered to the pre-pandemic levels. In contrast, the labor force participation patterns for non-college women differ based on the presence of young children. At the onset of the pandemic, non-college women with young children, shown by the orange line, experienced a larger decline in their labor force participation rate than non-college women without young children. The participation patterns for the two groups diverged again starting in the summer of last year. Although the labor force participation rates for non-college women with young children continued to recover from July to December of last year, the participation rate fell significantly for those with young children. All right, now let's focus on women without a bachelor's degree since they've seen a large decline, and compare the impact of having young children among different race and ethnicity groups in the next slide. Starting with non-Hispanic white women with and without young children, shown by the two blue lines, we see that they've experienced the smallest declines in their labor force participation rates. This is in contrast to the experience of Hispanic women, shown by the two orange lines. They have been hit the hardest during the downturn. Although some of the Hispanic women with young children re-entered the labor force during spring, their participation rates fell afterwards. Interestingly, the presence of young children seems to have made the biggest difference for non-Hispanic Black women, shown by the green lines. At the onset of the pandemic, the participation rates were similar for non-college Hispanic Black women as for non-Hispanic Black women with or without young children. However, the patterns for the two groups diverged as the economy began to recover. Starting in the summer of last year, the labor force participation rate increased rapidly for non-Hispanic Black women without young children. However, the participation rate fell for non-Hispanic Black women with young children until the end of 2020. But recently, we see a strong pickup in the participation rate of Black women with young children. Now, let's circle back to the three questions I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation. Moving to the next slide to conclude. All right, so the first question I proposed was how did pandemic-related job losses affect employment and labor force participation of prime age individuals? So just to conclude, during this recession, there has been a sharp decline in employment of prime age individuals, and this resulted in a dramatic decline in their labor force participation rate. Even as of May of 2021, their participation rate remains well below the pre-pandemic levels. The second and the third questions were, which groups within the prime age group have been hit the hardest by these job losses, and which groups are farthest from a full recovery? Well, the participation rates have been hit hardest and are farthest from recovery for women without a bachelor's degree who were more likely to be working in the context-sensitive sectors of the economy. Next, I considered different race and ethnicity groups within these non-college women. And I have shown you that Hispanic women seem to have benefited less from the recovery of jobs in the context-sensitive sectors, and their participation rates remain well below the pre-pandemic levels. Lastly, I considered whether presence of young children can explain differences in participation patterns. And I just showed you that presence of young children seems to be impacting women from minority groups more. So I'm hoping that these results will be useful for policymakers when designing policies targeted to encourage women to re-enter the labor force in the coming months. Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Didem. We do have a few questions for you. The first one, in regards to the pandemic, it brought about many changes and expansions to unemployment insurance. Any insight into how many people who left the labor force took advantage of unemployment insurance? And did the availability of unemployment insurance factor into their departure at all?
Well, that's a great question. So for the unemployment insurance, there have been big differences this time compared to the previous recessions. You know that the eligibility criteria were changed, especially for the federal programs. So yes, there have been many individuals that definitely benefited from these programs. And the aim of the programs was to keep people home, right? Because everybody was worried about having the virus and having more people go sick. So the policy was targeted to keep people home, which it did. Now, afterwards, of course, there have been some people who could maybe come back to labor force, but chose not to because of health concerns, because of the jobs that are available to them may not be paying high wages. So they might have kept benefiting from these programs. So we do not know exactly how many people would have come to the labor force but chose not to. This is a very difficult question to answer. But as you know, these programs are coming to an end very soon. So we're going to be watching how people will respond, whether they're going to go back to the labor force in big numbers. This is going to be an empirical question that we're going to be asking in the coming months.
And just a reminder for those of you that are joining us, if you want to submit a question for Didem, just to select the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and submit it that way, and we will get to as many as we can. Didem, was there any other information available related to how the pandemic impacted women and people of color, or women people of color? When we looked at the race and ethnicity demographics, or when you broke it down by those demographics, we really looked at white women, Hispanic women, and Black women. Was there anything for Asian American women as well, or was there any other information that you could share in regards to those demographics?
So that's actually a great question. So the reason why I did not include Asian women in this research project is simply because, the way it flows is who has been hit the hardest. It's the non-college women. And then with the non-college women, can we do a little bit more detailed analysis? And when you look at the Asian group, majority of women who are Asian, who are in the labor force, they're more likely to have college education. And that's the only reason why they're not in that group. And of course, they are also a small share. So that's the only reason. Other than that, I just tried to focus on a little bigger groups and among the non-college women.
Thank you. Do you have any more insight into the barriers to Hispanic women's participation in the labor market?
So I can have some speculations, based on the anecdotes that I hear, and based on the, articles that I read. There are a few factors. One is, of course, personal health conditions, illness concerns, especially given the nature of jobs that will be available to majority of Hispanic women. When we think about the hardest hit sectors, these are contact sensitive sectors. So the illness concerns are much bigger here. That's number one. Number two is, of course, childcare difficulties. So remote schooling, closure of daycares, not being able to find someone to babysit for your child. These are really making it difficult for women to go to work. And also when you think about the wages that are available to the low wage jobs, it's really making it difficult for many of these women to pay for childcare and also go to work. So those are things that have been very constraining from the labor supply side. On the labor demand side, I can speculate that maybe there's need for firms to think about the requirements, education requirements for work, and think about retraining opportunities to welcome more of these individuals back to the labor force.
That was going to be my next question about what does the research look like, including data on the impacts of childcare, but it sounds like we covered as much as we could.
Yeah, so my research here shows that for the minority women especially, presence of young children was important. So the participation rates definitely fell more within the same rates than ethnicity groups. So the participation rates fell more if you have children, and then your recovery has been much slower again if you have children. So there is definitely an effect that's impacted mothers more in this recession.
And as we talk about the unemployment rate, and that's really only counts people who are actively seeking employment, any thoughts on the real and total number of women who left the workforce?
Well, that's a great question. So the data source that I'm using is the current population survey, where basically individuals are asked certain questions and then they respond to those questions. So it's self-reported, right? And the BLS noted during the pandemic, every month they publish their employment report, that there can be some error in these numbers simply because people misreporting or answering the questions in a different way, given the very unique nature of the pandemic. It's not clear whether you're searching for a job because there are no jobs available. Everyone's telling you to stay at home, etc. So there could have been some measurement errors. But now that we're far along the way in the pandemic, I think those measurement errors are less. So what does this mean? It means that when we see people who are not in the labor force, they are really not in the labor force. They're no longer unemployed, but not searching for jobs because of the pandemic, right? A lot of the states are now opening up, and you would expect people who want to return to the labor force actively search for jobs. So that's why the numbers that we see are worrying, especially for the non-college women, given that in every recession, in every previous recession we've seen, these women take a much bigger hit in terms of employment losses, in terms of participation decline than college-educated women, and then they do not fully recover. So a few years ago, I wrote another piece with my co-author on the prime age labor force participation rate recovery after the Great Recession. And there again, the result was for non-college women, they've left the labor force, and not many of them are coming back. And you might ask, what is the reason behind it? It can be a handful of things. After the Great Recession, my thesis was it was mostly related to automation. Some of these jobs that they used to work at have been automated. So when they want to come back, there is no need for their skills. So the solution would be, helping these people regain some of the skills that are now in high demand. That would be very important for employers to consider retraining opportunities, etc. Now, in this pandemic, now that normalization period is continuing, many things are opening up. If we again see non-college women falling behind in terms of participation, we will again need to think about whether these jobs are being automated, whether it's more of a demand issue, whether their skills are no longer needed. And another thing is, again, from an employer's point of view, when there's a pool of people searching for jobs, then you would likely pick the one with, greater education, etc. So that's why I mentioned the requirements for jobs. So that's another thing that employers could help pull more people back to jobs.
Great, thank you. And as a follow-up to the question on unemployment experience, would the choice to return to work be much of a choice once unemployment benefits expire? Could the data mask the social issues surrounding the timing of a return to work at all?
So is the question about, is it a choice or do people have to go back to work? So I think it's a combination of both, right? If I understand the question correctly. So again, it's, whether is it the labor supply that's really being the constraint, or is it labor demand? So if it's labor supply, it means workers are choosing to stay home. Then once those benefits go away, then we should see an increase in labor supply. But still, if the health conditions are important to people and there's, continuing illness concerns with the, variants of the virus being around, then, we might see people still be scared to go back to work, right? Another thing is, not everyone still has access to childcare that's going to help them. So we will need schools back to be in person. We need daycares to open up. I'm reading news about, daycares having these long lists of people waiting to have access to. So that's another thing that would be constraining labor supply. And another thing would be wages, right? So if only available jobs are paying really low wages, then it will be a very difficult choice for a lot of people to be like, is it worth to go back to work? Is it going to be able to afford, am I going to be able to afford childcare if I leave my child to a daycare facility? Things like that. So from the labor demand point of view, it's about the expectations of firms. Are they willing to retrain workers? Are they willing to, help them acquire new skills? How much investment has gone to automation? That's something that we do not know at this moment. So it's really, coming from labor supply impacts, but also labor demand impacts. So again, it's going to be an empirical question once these benefits are no longer available, how these labor supply and labor demands forces will be impacting participation of a lot of these individuals.
The affordability of childcare seems to be a common theme. Is that more speculation, or is there data available on that decision, or a way that we can collect information on that?
I mean, everything that I've said so far is really based on anecdotes and that everything that I've been reading about. As far as I know, I'm not aware of a data source that asks, directly whether, are you sending your child to a daycare facility, or if not, would you like to? I'm not aware of a data source like that, but if anybody is aware of something like that, please let me know. I'd be really happy to look into it. But I think this is not a new theme, right? It's always been a challenge for many families to have the balance of one spouse going to work or taking care of children. For many families, it's been the choice of who's earning less, so can stay at home with the kids. And historically, I guess it's been mostly women, and it wasn't much different this time in terms of choosing who's going to stay home and take care of children. But even for families who are not constrained like that, there is a supplement to the CPS survey, which is about the time use of individuals. Even when you don't have those kind of monetary concerns, just looking at the data of how much time do you spend taking care of the house, taking care of children, it's been consistently, whether it's a recession or not, it's been consistently higher for women. So they always spend, whether they're working or not, they always spend more time with children in general, or on average, than their spouses, than men.
Do we have any data, or is there data currently being collected on the scope of the economic impact caused by the decline in employment for women?
That's a great question, and that would make a great paper. I'm not sure if that's been written yet, but I mean, just thinking about the potential, the decline in the potential, which is what we're learning from the labor force participation rate. I think I have that already in my research. We do not have as many people in the labor force as we used to have pre-pandemic. So that means the potential is less. So the goal is to go back to that potential to be able to afford economic growth going forward. On top of that, so the long term, so that was the short term consequence, right? The long term consequence would be so if we wait longer, if the virus concerns are no longer there, are we going to see these people come back to the labor force? So will there be a long-term impact such that you were not working for a certain period of time for a long term, and now you have even less demand for your skills? So that will be the real cost of the pandemic in the long term, if we're going to be losing people because they're not going to be able to come back because their skills are no longer in demand. And I tried to address that a little bit after the Great Recession, and that's one word that I have about participation rate, especially for these individuals without a college degree.
Sounds like we might have the next topic for your next paper.
Yeah, no, that was a great question.
Another question related to low-wage jobs. That is some of the narrative you hear, that some people are gaining more for unemployment than they are from their jobs. Is there research into the cost of living and cost of labor compared to average pay across demographics?
Can you repeat the last part? Is there
research into the cost of living and cost of labor compared to the average pay across demographics?
Yes. So last year, when the pandemic had first started, professors at University of Chicago, they wrote a paper looking at how many workers across the country would be able to have their pays without working, but through these programs. So there is a paper out there. I cannot recall the name, and I think at this point it's a publication at the Journal of Public Economics. And I think it's a very interesting paper. Exactly, looking at that point, cost of living is different in different parts of the nation, whereas we have this fixed amount added to the UI benefits, so it's going to be impacting workers in different regions differently. If I recall correctly, of course, that is one concern, but low-wage jobs are low-wage jobs on the other hand. So people who are working below the federal minimum wage definitely have benefited from these programs, regardless of where they were across the country. But whoever is interested, I'd be happy to provide a link for that paper. I can't remember the name at the moment.
Well, if you're interested, they can always email me, and I'll get that link from you, Dita.
Yeah, or email me. Feel free to email me as well.
Sounds good. Well, one final question for you. What factors would encourage women to re-enter the workforce?
Yeah. So again, I'm going to be kind of like summing up everything I've said with these great questions. Again, thanks everyone for these great questions and some research ideas that you gave me. So again, this is the play between labor supply and labor demand. So on the labor supply side, we need people to feel comfortable enough to go back to work. There should not be illness concerns, especially for the contact sensitive sectors. People need to start feeling comfortable and safe to go back to the workplace. The second thing will be, of course, childcare. In-person schooling, once it returns, we may see more women coming back to the labor force. Again, daycares, maybe more affordability there, or some help with childcare will definitely can be useful to bring more of these women back to work. And also flexibility and remote work. So for people who cannot send their kids to school at the moment or to daycare, if they can have some flexibility with hours or remote work, maybe that can also help pull more of women from the sidelines. And then lastly, of course, wages. If the wages are very low, then it puts people at a very difficult position to make that decision to go back to work or not, especially when these programs are available through the government. So again, this is something that we're going to be watching very closely, whether we're going to see any increase in wages for especially certain types of jobs. And will people be, coming back to work once these programs are no longer available? And then on the labor demand side, of course, it's the expectation of firms and, their willingness to provide retraining opportunities, their willingness to maybe soften some of the requirements. And it will also depend on how much automation investment has been made at this time. And even if that is the case, can we help workers have the new skills that will be on demand and pull more people back into the labor force? So I guess it's just we're gonna have a lot to see in the next coming months as these forces play each other out.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to seeing what the rest of the year looks like. So thank you for your time today, Didem, and for sharing information around women in the workforce. Very interesting. I appreciate it. And thank you everyone for joining us today.